So we got a bunch of rich feedback, kept modifying the drafts, and then rolled out with our final vision at the end of 2013. And so it's a 2024 vision. And in it, our goal is to have 1 to 3 new businesses by 2024. So it's continued slow, deliberate growth, but businesses that are
Times, which is like an English newspaper, covers business. I never read it. I mean, I'd be more likely to pick up a copy of the Post or the Daily News than the Financial Times. And what was like so pathetic about this was the fact that it wasn't even that day's Financial Times. It was probably 6 months old. But that was the kind of, state that I was in. And as I'm kind of thumbing through this newspaper, I see a story that catches my attention. And the story...
rather poor, as those of you who know your English history will know, this is what caused Charles I to have his head chopped off. It's his inadequate approach to taxation. Well, if you talk to Americans about British taxation, this is kind of dangerous territory. But all right, we're talking about Canada at the moment rather than the other 13 colonies. But so what happened was that Charles I was selling essentially titles. He was selling peerages and, in my case, baronets.
English people on holiday in Germany, students from all over the world studying in German universities, a cultured country, a country of great music, of arts, an amazing country that was doing these absolutely horrendous things, and they were all going on in the midst of Europe.
English poetry, Shakespeare's plays, and Italian medieval and Renaissance tales. A highlight of the exhibition is the haunting and macabre watercolour, Oh What's That in the Hollow, inspired by Christina Rossetti's poem Amor Mundi, or Earthly Love. It shows a gaunt, bony dead body lying in a hollow and surrounded by wild roses which twine around and enclose it. The exhibition ends with a room dedicated to what one critic called those harmonies of deep, luminous blues of which Hughes seems to have the secret.
I'm English, but I'm Iranian. I've done all my studying in America. I consider myself objective, and I consider what I do, perhaps the fact that I have so many international influences allows me to actually tell the other side of the story and all sides of the story in a way that's less chauvinistic than if I was just one person or one religion or one nationality or one ethnic group. You know what I mean? I'm a woman. Am I biased? I don't know. You could ask people.
But her English was near fluent, and after years of begging and badgering the bureau chief, he finally started giving her work, as if the very behavior that had gotten her sent to the corner as a child was the thing that garnered his respect. It was true, he said, that she was living in one of the hardest countries to find staff jobs. No one ever left their positions at the Israeli papers, and reporters from all over the world competed for work at the foreign ones. But with her language skills, probably the one time her Slavic literature degree made her more employable, he'd lobby the higher-ups in Chicago to send her to Kiev if things got bad enough to need
in English and emoticons, and I don't know if you can use emoji or whatever now in YouTube comments, but so that in the beginning of Web 2.0 I was like, oh, that strange literacy that I remember from our Dungeons and Dragons meets Reaganomics meets I don't know, there was a lot of like damsels and steeds and Led Zeppelin that sort of influenced our language in the 70s online.
There was a while when every computer server was named Gandalf.
Oh, yes, exactly.
Like every
exactly.
university, it was like, you could tell it was the same.
Do that. Another thing, when you have transitions between, so everybody speaks English all of the time, but when you have transitions between what is English and then ostensibly Arabic conversation, how do you manage those moments of transition?
Well, we don't think about them a lot.
Okay.
That's the honest truth. I mean, the Arabs do use an accent. But
Joseph doesn't.
But Joseph doesn't, but he does in one area of the play, he does. When he's talking to the Turkish officer.
And he rose through his own abilities to become an administrator of the English Navy. He personally witnessed some of the major events of his time. He was on the boat when Charles II returned from exile to be crowned. He was in London during the plague and the Great Fire of London. He thought his eyesight was failing, and in 1669, with some regret, stopped writing his diary. In the event, his sight wasn't impaired. Nevertheless, it remains a remarkable document, and one of the most vivid and personal portraits of the 17th century we have.
After dinner, we into our dining room, and then...
Which, in Middle English...
No, don't go there. Oh, my God. Yeah.
Lightning.
Yes, the dark secret of my family, which my parents swear they didn't know when they named me Thunder, is that Levin actually means lightning. And I found that out to my great dismay sometime in high school. Somebody had looked it up and confronted me with it, and I was like, no.
Before the internet? Before the internet,
yeah. They found an unabridged dictionary. And I was like, no, that can't be. My parents wouldn't do that to me. Well, as it turns out.
So, other than that, how did your...
One way, people within English may very well do it another way.
Without sort of a body in the middle that coalesces this idea of learning design, what you end up with is you end up with very inconsistent applications of technology. You end up with people who use technology for technology's sake and not doing it very thoughtfully. And then you end up with people who sort of shy away from technology because they're afraid that they don't have the kind of support that they need. So without a place like ETS where faculty can go to, and a lot of times I say they can go to really get courageous. So they have an environment where they can try things and fail without looking bad in front of their students. So without that, you end up with
is the author, and it's in bookstores everywhere, worldwide now in English. You've got a British, a Canadian, and an American edition out now. Yes, sir.
Dr. Smolin, are you suggesting that unless I can imagine it, conceive it, think it, it does not exist?
No. I'm a big believer in objectivity and I'm a realist.
Oh, objectivity? How do you mean?
I think that there is a real world out there, and it is recalcitrant to our desires and hopes and expectations and beliefs.
Spiral, not inclusive exclusive, but inclusive and extractive. Her English is very good, but for 5 minutes she broke into German with her 4 or 5 colleagues, and they came up with 17 different synonyms in German for extractive. And it's the very sinister side of the lack of inclusivity. We have made that work, not perfectly, but that will be the great test, I think, of whether we can make that work and see our culture enriched by those different streams coming together. As Saint-Exupéry said in Le Petit Prince, I am different from you, but because I am different, I do not diminish you, I enrich in you.
Yes, it's beautiful.
Taking a true or false exam, the 100 people can't speak a word of English, and again they take this exam. Now, on average, we expect people to perform at 50%, but again, Jane performs poorly on this exam, and Billy performs well. Now, before we separate Jane and Billy and we go on to the testing on day 2, let's do some interventions. Let's give them a vial of water, or let's give them some brain training, or ask them to close their eyes and jump, to hop on one foot, right? And now we go to day 2, and then they take the exam again.
novices when it comes to speaking the English language. And so they don't understand a single question on that entire exam. Okay, so they're just reading this gibberish and then marking either true or false as a response. Now, as a result, so we have 100 people, 100 questions. As a result of taking that test, you're going to have some people who took that test. Most people are going to get about 50% on average, but some people are going to perform better than 50%. In fact, with a group of about 100 people, I would imagine to have 2 or even 3 people who score 60% or even higher, say.
That we can go anywhere around the world and speak English for the most part. We can hear American music. We can watch American movies. We can buy American brands. This is something that some criticize because they believe that this suppresses local languages, local products, local ways of life. So there are 2 sides to this story. But no matter which side you come down on, one thing we do know, and that is globalization means that it's a smaller world in which we live. Meaning that we can communicate much easier, we can travel much easier, we can get to know each other much easier. It's a smaller world in which we live.
His climate modelling also explained the poor performance of the English cricket team.
One of the test matches that we lost was almost right bang in the middle of the most Mordor-like climate, so I think that almost certainly explained our whitewash by the Aussies this year.
Lunt's next task was to communicate the results of his research. But what other surprises lay in store for the climate model of Middle-earth? With the climate modelling completed, the next step for Lunt was to do what all scientists
One of the things I love to do when I'm out with lots of English people is to make them all rank each other according to their level of poshness, because they can all do it, right? And it makes them very uncomfortable, but they kind of like doing it. So there was about 10 of them. And so I said, okay, rank yourself. Tell me who's the poshest. And so it was pretty clear that Richard and John were the poshest. But neither of them wanted, then they were like, well, who's posher of the 2 of us? And neither wanted to be the poshest. So they started to have an argument in front of us about who was posher. And Richard said to John, you're posher because your grandfather's butler used to pick you up every morning and drive you to Eton.
One day I pulled down my copy of the Oxford English Dictionary and looked up the term sustainable, and actually the definition is pretty simple. It's how to maintain something, how to keep something going. Now, where the question becomes more complex is how do you keep a food system going, and how do you maintain it so that it feeds our human population in a quote sustainable way. Now there you begin to have that's where you can begin to have the debate, and the predominant.
It would be the Hobbesian state of nature after the ideas of the English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes said that life without a government is, quote, nasty, brutish, and short. And not, as one student wrote, nasty, British, and short. Nasty, brutish, in short. It wouldn't be very pleasant to live in such a society. So when we don't have a government, there are 3 things we could do. We can produce things. We can steal other people's things, or we can spend time protecting our own things.
Across town, some of the non-English programs that have kind of been rebranded under this Orwellian Mandarin immersion programs, and we're just trying to think of how we navigate this and how we can keep ourselves and our friends in town with what seems to be a lottery system that was started with good intentions but leads to a lot of sort of mediocrity across the board.
Thank you. That's probably very challenging because also the school district's always being challenged. And if you pay attention to what the state's doing, and they're about to say if they can't figure out their budget crisis, they put it down on the locals. And guess what? Education gets.
Students do well in English, math, and science, and that they are graduating at a high rate, ready for college or career. But it's also important for us to value all of the other things that we know in North Dakota and in this region comprise a quality school. And a quality school is made up of the things that I think every parent knows when they walk into a school of their child or their nieces or their nephews or their grandparents walk into their grandchildren's school. They recognize a quality school, but they're not looking at test.
About the project in English.
A really touching moment for me, especially when we had this family, such as Dad and his two daughters, who really touched my heart. One of them, she actually cried when I made her a bracelet, and to me it was just a bracelet, like I make something my little sister makes for me or I make for her. But for them, it was, they've never had something like that.
I really appreciate what I have in America here, and helping people around the world is a really good thing that also not only empowers.
Or interested in a certain set of things. I assume that you at least can understand English. I assume that I say Facebook and you can no longer know what I mean. But that's all, the assumptions that I make are dependent on the audience in which I'm presenting to. Can I make those same assumptions to the person at the other end of the camera? Can I make the same assumptions to the person at the other end of the camera 10 years from now? Probably not. So how do you actually contend with invisible audiences? How do you make sense of it? The fact of the matter is most of the time we don't. We play ostrich, we hope it will all go away and everything will be fine. Or we try to convey to other people what we think our audience is. And this is one of the constant tensions within these spaces, and something that young people have to deal with.
They found the markers in English or European populations, and they went out looking for diversity out there. So,
and the reality is, I mean, as you mentioned, our knowledge of bacterial diversity today is not complete. It's really limited.
That's right.
And so you're looking for things, and the only tools you have are what you know already.
That's right.
But you could be looking for something that nobody's noticed yet.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And so that's it. That's a big problem, and something we're trying to address actually with additional work that we're doing right now, which is actually to screen human remains for a...
Well, if you live in an English-speaking country, America, the UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, then you are going to be familiar with the phenomenon of organised, politically active climate scepticism. In the States, it's a pretty good indicator of whether you will vote Republican or Democrat, your views on climate change. It has become a really polarised issue, and this is a big problem because we need a societal consensus to take the kind of action that we need, I would argue. And the climate skeptics have done a very good job of creating doubt, false doubt around the climate science, which really narrows the political space.
This is an ancient, one of these rights that comes out of the English constitutional tradition that is then expressly guaranteed by the Bill of Rights and is one of the most fundamental sources of individual rights in the American tradition. No individual can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law. And so we see this essential defense in this case of liberty. Now, the Fifth Amendment, the Bill of Rights, originally is meant to apply to the federal government. And so the First Amendment, for instance, which protects the basic rights of speech and religion, is
minimum wage causes more competition for jobs. A supermarket job that once paid $8 per hour draws more applicants when it pays $15 per hour. Applicants who include retirees and people with higher education who re-enter the workforce only because of the higher wage. Because these people often have more skills, they squeeze out immigrants and those from disadvantaged backgrounds who are likely more desperate for the jobs and certainly more desperate to gain job experience. The third reason is that minimum wage hikes aren't necessary to give deserving workers raises. 96% of American workers today earn wages higher than the current minimum wage.
I have students who have poor English skills. Right now I have a class with the opposite, very, very high functioning adults. I think some of them have bachelor's degrees already, and everything seems to be at a higher level this time. So kind of adapt to the students, really. Try to push them, and then if you have higher performing students, try to challenge them even more so.
In terms of
and English language development stresses the need to provide additional high-quality, small group intervention to your students who are struggling in literacy, English language development, or both. There is moderate evidence in research to support this recommendation. Let's consider 3 big ideas here. First, small group instruction should be provided on a daily basis. Second, small group instruction should be teacher-directed.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's 6-Minute English. We hope you've had a stress-free time. Please do join us again soon. You know where to find us, don't you? Go to bbclearningenglish.com, where you'll find grammar points, vocabulary, and more editions of 6-Minute English. Goodbye.
Bye.
6-Minute English
from the BBC.
About with like the common English property, you can't take land that everybody's sharing in common.
Interesting.
And also you can't take land unless you make sure that there's as much land as possible left for other people to take as well. So if you're taking common, so you have to make sure that whenever you take land or that there's enough left for other people to use, that's
Right.
just as good as the land that you took. So
That's true. Locke says there has to be this right to private property in the earth is subject to the provision that there be as much and as good left for others. What's your name?
right. I'm Fang.
So Fang.
English major kinds of people. So I was already interested in Latin America. Growing up in California, so many people spoke Spanish, and we were right on the border with Mexico. So that was already of interest to me. And I thought, well, I'll do Latin American studies, because then I can do Latin American literature within that, and I'll still read the books, just still be in Spanish. I was like, okay. And while I was there at Vassar, we didn't have requirements. So I could go through my whole college career without taking math or science. And I thought that.
English professors are never invited to the email party. Well, librarians were not invited to the internet party early enough. So what we're doing now is we're taking that open content, and a lot of our catalogers are using metadata to help that material be found much easier for our faculty, because it's better to teach them how to fish than to keep fishing for them. At the same time, a lot of our librarians are finding these repositories that exist and directing our faculty to these repositories, showing them how they work, and then letting them go out and do some fishing on their own.
French, just like English, is compressed for the keyboard and for the chat environment. And they usually like that very much.
Darwin was. But when they come here, perhaps led by their parents or the staff of English Heritage, they look at his collections and his life, which is brought to life in such an exciting and exhilarating and fun way, that they will leave thinking, I've been in the place where a great man lived and thought and came up with remarkable ideas in an incredibly important time. I like to think that some of those young people might leave thinking, I would be a biologist too. They might be stimulated by what they found here, because after all, in the future, we're going to need more Darwins to help us look after
of the English system.
During the First World War, education had inevitably not been the nation's priority. Schools and teachers struggled on as best they could, with reduced budgets, lack of staff, and deteriorating buildings. In Parliament, many agreed with the verdict of one senior MP who considered the education system to be in ruins.
What World War I did was highlight many of the tensions and concerns in the English education system, which had really been
that stands for something that we can all understand if we speak English. Every communication has some idiosyncratic elements because there's a transferential aspect that expresses something about my history as I'm making that communication. And every communication has a cultural aspect, we could say an existential aspect, we could say a spiritual aspect, it goes on. Now what's happened is that theorists in psychotherapy have sort of staked out a territory, like Roger staked out the territory of affect. And so when he was presenting, his focus was on bringing out the underlying affect, where Beck would be working more with belief.
I explain in my reflection in my page for English that it was a great way to get out in the community. We participated in a service learning experience. I helped out with Wasatch Community Gardens, so I was able to learn a little bit more about gardening and growing my own food and where food comes from. I even created a little blog for them about indoor gardening tips, and I have added a presentation that I did for a class to explain who Wasatch Community Gardens is and what their goal and mission in life.
Legend, and its wood was once used to make the English longbow. And despite being largely toxic, it even has medicinal uses. Taxol has been isolated from the yew and is now used as a chemotherapy drug, serving to remind us that beyond what we see on the surface, this plant and all of our worthy winners provide us with so much more than just being green. For more information about plants, visit our website, bigpictureeducation.com.
The English political philosopher John Locke and examine his account of private property and self-ownership. And that's what we'll do next time.
Don't miss the chance to interact online with other viewers of Justice. Join the conversation, take a pop quiz, watch lectures you've missed, and learn a lot more. Visit justiceharvard.org. It's the right thing to do.
Spain to repeated English aggression against the Spanish Empire, both abroad and at home. Philip decided to quell England once and for all by sending the Armada. And here it is at the top, maintaining this perfect crescent of a defensive formation as it sails up the channel towards the Spanish Netherlands. And suddenly, the wind, which had been favourable, turns into a fierce southerly, and it blows them north, away from their rendezvous in the Netherlands, right up the east coast of England, and they flee before it. What a...
On this side it's all written in English, but if you get stuck you can try your luck on the other side, where the instructions are written in German. The trays are factory sealed with tape so we can give the knife an outing, and when we lift the lid we can see that the model is quite big. This model is different from the previous LHM 500 version, and one of the differences is that the boom sections on this model are joined together by tiny brass nuts and bolts. Tools are provided to do them up, but on the review model one of the tools didn't fit very well.
Well, that's the end of today's 6-Minute English. Don't forget to join us again soon. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
6-Minute English
from the BBC.
English boy who prayed every night, God restore your people to their land, and he's used to do it. So here it happens.
That's
and
amazing.
then when does it, so they issue the Balfour Declaration, which says the Jewish people can return. This will be a Jewish homeland. So here's the beginning of this prophetic jubilee. When does it happen? Happens November 1917, right in the biblical prophetic parameters of when the restoration, the jubilee, according to the seventh Shemitah. And so what happens? Everyone shall return to the land. Jewish people returning to become a homeland. They will return to their ancestral possession. What happens now if we go, I mean, that's enough there, but what happens if we go 7 Shemitahs into the...
Well, that just about brings us to the end of this edition of 6 Minute English. We hope you've enjoyed this programme. Please do join us again soon. Bye.
Goodbye.
6 Minute English
From the BBC.
Pope Gregory, Augustine took a gradualist approach to the evangelization of the English, adapting pagan temple buildings to churches and adopting pagan holy days as Christian feasts. St. Bede, in his history, quotes a letter of 601 from the Pope to Abbot Mellitus, who had been sent to help Augustine in Kent.
When by God's help you reach our most reverend brother Bishop Augustine, we wish you to inform him that we have been giving careful thought to the affairs of the English, and have come to the conclusion that the temples of idols among that people should on no account be destroyed. The idols are to be destroyed
where it sent criminals. But then the Americans rose up against the English, so that was no longer an option. So the government decided to set up a new penal colony in a land called New South Wales. Captain Cook in 1770.
John Hudson, you are sentenced to transportation across the seas for a period of 7 years.
11 ships were prepared for the voyage to New South Wales. 6 would transport convicts. They were the Alexander, the Friendship, the Charlotte, the Lady Penn.
State University and major in English with the hopes of becoming a high school teacher.
Whether you know exactly what you want to do, or if you're undecided and have lots of questions about what careers are possible, our career centers and academic advisors, including myself, are here to help you understand PCC's career and academic pathways. We can tell you about resources and programs.
I teach high school seniors and I teach English for them, so it's a required class that they have to graduate. For some of them it's not their favorite subject, but for others they really love it. This is their last year before they graduate, so they have a lot that they have to accomplish.
When I first got into teaching, I thought that I would be able to plan an entire day and get to school on time, the day to go just as planned, and for there to be no bumps in the day.
Effectiveness. A lot of, the stereotype, the English or the philosophy professor who says students can't learn this way. They need the wisdom of the scholar to guide them through this material. And it's not going to work on the internet. So there was that skepticism. But what combated the skepticism was the success of those who tried it. And at one point, there was a union issue. This is going to put teachers out of work, and the head of our union said, we've got to fight against this. And I said, well, before you...
Well, that's the end of today's 6 Minute English. Remember to join us again soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
6 Minute English
from the BBC.
the Department of English, the Division of Student Affairs, Multicultural Student Services, the Department of History, the George and Bernadine Converse Historical Endowment, and Roots of Contemporary Issues. So thanks to all for making this opportunity possible. And so now, why are we all here? Jay Smooth is a hip-hop scholar, cultural commentator, and one of the most effective and relatable public intellectuals out there today. Jay's talent for cutting through complicated issues with a critical eye and wit to get to the heart of the matter.
Articles further behind every other English-speaking country in the world. They're all ahead of the United States. And part of the reason for that is because we have so much media that's indigenous, we don't realize what it's like to have media come from the outside. I'd say use more than one source. One source isn't good enough. And maybe deliberately look at really alternative sources. And always be skeptical about what motive does that media company have in putting that out there. The third thing I guess I would say is, what aren't they telling me? And they may not even know what they aren't telling you because the reporters are not the best informed people in the world. But I mean, what's missing?
Gray hair and his English accent, he convinced them he didn't know anything about it. But if they'd have thought he had anything to do with it, they would have hugged him on the spot.
Oh, I believe it too.
And that's why I was so amazed when I found out that he took slaves with a wagon to the Nebraska line. And I think, boy, that man had to be very brave and very committed.
What do you think was one of the determining factors that pushed him to the anti-slavery side?
I'd like to think that he thought it was just a very important thing to do. And I think I'd probably be
for Shakespeare. Also, you had a taste for English history, and you'll see several examples upstairs. This was fed also by literature, especially Sir Walter Scott, who was extremely popular in the United States during this period. This is Richard Caton Woodville, who made his reputation with genre paintings. He did American genre as well as English genre. And as I said, this
across the Himalayas to escape from Tibet, not speaking any English, starving people who, when they got to India and saw a banana plantation, he wouldn't let them eat the bananas for fear that they were poison. And 12 years later, he's teaching at the University of Colorado, having made a stop at Oxford, shows up in Boulder, and in 1974, at the convocation which launched Naropa at the time, gave a talk about reigniting a pilot light that would bring wisdom back into the sort of Western academy, which was focused very much on knowledge, but not as much from his perspective.
Are Indo-European languages like English and Dutch and Romanian for that matter. But French and German are rather different. And as a result of that, the Osage and the Kansa did not necessarily view the Missouri as necessarily a compatible group of people. They did view each other, that is the Kansa and the Osage, viewed each other as being, you might say, close relatives. And indeed, probably when they moved out of
my colleague, and he said, I hate speaking in English. What about Annette? And I hadn't even finished my thesis then. And she said, oh, yes, what about Annette? So off I went to give my very first talk outside the office as a keynote address. I didn't know which way to put the overheads. You know, I'd never done that before. And it launched my career, so what can I say?
Well, it did launch your career, and you landed in a number of places we've mentioned before. Max Planck, you spent some time at UC Berkeley, we mentioned CMU. How did you land?
Thinks it's the perfect name for their shared victory, but Wellington prefers the more English-sounding Waterloo, where he has his own headquarters. The Battle of Waterloo was, in the words of the Duke of Wellington, a damned near-run thing. It was also one of the bloodiest battles of the age. Around 50,000 men were killed or wounded, 23,000 coalition casualties, 27,000 French. Due to an appalling shortage of medical care, many of the wounded were left lying on the
which is often described in English as the Great Law of Peace. This form of governance was in place when colonists first arrived in North America. The protocols that Haudenosaunee people practiced among themselves and with foreign tribal nations also shaped their diplomatic relationships with colonists. These protocols later informed interactions with the emerging United States government in the decades following the Revolutionary War. They were critical to the Treaty of Canandaigua.
Merchants of Tarshish were the English, and they were known as the land of tin, which is, of course, the Bronze Age was a combination of tin and copper. Copper, by the way, that might have come from the United States as much as 2,500 years ago. So that's another whole study in and of itself. But nevertheless, you have this lineage that eventually moves to the New World. And so that's one of the arguments that we have, is that it is the descendants, there is a connection between Dan and the Greeks and the Romans, which Daniel, of course, talks about in his book.
The language, the culture, the lack of friends was very tough for me at the beginning. And I learned English relatively fast. I got more comfortable here. I really started appreciating the United States even more. After that, I just decided I need to go to the college. I studied business administration with concentrations in finance. So we applied for IBM, we applied for Microsoft and Intel. And I got a response from Microsoft within a week. So I went there, and I think they liked me, and they just gave me an offer within a week. It was a good match for me, and I accepted the offer, and now I'm there. And I really never lived on my own before, so it was really difficult to actually move there. But once I moved,
to English learners can be an overwhelming task for teachers due to the number of errors students make. Another problem is the limited amount of writing students are able to produce for a writing assignment. Designing and implementing effective peer collaboration can also be challenging. The panel discusses these 3 roadblocks at the end of this recommendation and makes suggestions for how they might be addressed as you implement this recommendation. Thank you.
But there's only 3 articles in the English language. That's a, an, and the. Okay? So you use these all the time, and there's not many to memorize. You know, there's a million adjectives. There's as many nouns as you can imagine, okay? But there's only 3 articles, okay? And we split these into the indefinite, article, and the definite article.
English language learners. Another 15% have language-based learning difficulties, such as dyslexia. An additional 20% fail language comprehension tests, and a large portion of the remaining students characterize themselves as visual learners. Left over, there's only a tiny little segment of students for whom current teaching methods are a good fit. And I was one of those students way down there. I have dyslexia, and for me, words were really
to English language publishers. So, for example, although well over 100 books are translated from French and published in the UK each year, most of them will come from countries like France or Switzerland. French-speaking Africa, on the other hand, will rarely ever get a look in. The upshot is that there are actually quite a lot of nations that may have little or even no commercially available literature in English. Their books remain invisible to readers of the world's most published language. But when it came to reading the world, the biggest challenge.
It dates, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, to the year 1651, when it was said that the soul underwent a new investiture with the same upper garment clarified. By the Middle Ages, investiture became the action or ceremony of clothing in the insignia of an office, the ceremonial, official, or formal investing of a person with an office. It is with that depth of meaning that we today invest in Dr. Pink and clothe him with the Presidential Medallion of Grand Rapids.
So, for example, all of our kids take IB English. The vast majority of our kids, upwards of 80%, take International Baccalaureate Math. So we have a really good, successful, rich program, and this is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So you're retiring this year.
I am. I'm taking early retirement.
So somebody else is going to have to implement the Common Core in the high school.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. My assistant principal, and he's wonderful.
Yeah.
But it really got, Ronnie, what happened to me was I made the decision.
Policy issues like military spending and making English the official language of the US, you're going to be more persuasive if you tie those conservative policy issues to liberal moral values like equality and fairness. All these studies have the same clear message. If you want to persuade someone on some policy, it's helpful to connect that policy to their underlying moral values. And when you say it like that, it seems really obvious, right? Like, why did we come here tonight? Why? It's incredibly intuitive. And even though it is,
I was a cheerleader, and I was speaking English, and I was hanging out with my friends, and I was thinking about going to high school and started to thinking about college. Like, being undocumented was not something that I understood. But I did understand what it meant to be undocumented once I started applying to colleges. Because I believed my mom when she told me about this American dream, and I believed my mom when she told me about the formula that I needed to follow. And I was incredibly, deeply disappointed to find out.
So I speak plain English in court. A great example of this was when I was a young judge. Younger judge. When I was a younger judge, a senior judge comes to me, gives me a script and says, if you think somebody has mental health issues, ask them these questions and then you can get your evaluation. So the first time I saw someone who had what I thought was a mental health issue, I went from a script and I started to ask questions. Sir, do you take psychotropic medication? Nope. Sir, have you treated with a psychiatrist before? Nope. But it was obvious.
Here. In plain English, it makes bad places worse. So let's go to another place here. Now we're going to go 2,000 kilometers or about 1,200 miles north of Oslo, only 600 miles from the pole. And this is arguably the most strategic island you've never heard of. It's a place called Svalbard. It sits astride the sea lanes that the Russian Northern Fleet needs to get out and go into warmer waters. It is also, by virtue of its geography, a place where you can control every single polar orbiting satellite on every orbit. It is the strategic high ground of space.
Shortest quotes in the English language by Muhammad Ali. Me, we. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Few years later, English class, first paper of a new semester, and I get the paper back, and it's C+ with the comment, good as can be expected. Now, honestly, I didn't mind a C+. I was just happy it wasn't a C- or D. But the good as can be expected comment, even at that young age, it didn't seem right. It seems so.
And she said to me, well, we don't do French, we don't do English, we don't do whatever. Her whole thing was about saying that we embrace being a kind of, inhabitant of the world. Right. And so this whole transcending kind of discourse and language and mindset, and what she wanted to emphasize to her child was, in no way was she disowning the fact that she had, white and French ancestors, but that, Chinese and white French ancestors, but that wasn't what was primary. What she wanted to communicate was this sense of transcending these national.
Morgan Gallimore, we read your book in our English class last semester, and I can say it changed my life. But I have a question for both of you. I was wondering how you guys both got to, or how you all got to real time, as you said, like the experience in your life that led you to looking at institutionalized racism, and like when you started fighting back, and what led you to Citizen, and what led you to being where you are today. So that's my question.
Hi, Claudia.
But we haven't just done this in English. We thought it was essential that people should be able to use this system in their own language. So far, we've built it into 14 languages, including French, Swahili, and Arabic. And we're working on more now, like Xhosa, Zulu, and Hindi. But this idea can do a lot more than just get my musicians to their gigs on time. If the 75% of countries that struggle with reliable addressing started using three-word addresses, there's a stack of far more important applications. In Durban, South Africa, an NGO called Gateway Health have distributed 11,000 three-word address signs.
Back all the way into Old English over 1,000 years. But by about 1400, it had also come to refer to a lewd woman or an immoral woman. And then shortly thereafter, it was also used to refer to a domineering woman or a woman who was like a man. And you see this really interesting proliferation of meaning for the word bitch in the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s, where bitch, when applied to a woman, is always pretty much negative. And bitch is also applied to men at this point.
Calculus, chemistry, English, all those subjects, straight A's again, no problem, very easy. My second quarter, I took a course, my very first quote-unquote engineering course, and it was called Engineering Graphics. And for the first time in my life, I had no idea what was going on. I was struggling. I had no idea how to solve the problems. I had no idea what the teacher was talking about. And what made it worse for me is that all of these friends of mine, they were
serving as president of the Iowa Council of Teachers of English, and much more. Slow down. Plus, she's got these three cute kids in front. With Sarah as a teacher, good students have become great students. Students who'd been discouraged and disengaged have discovered a passion for learning. And many of her students have gone on to become teachers themselves, one of the best tributes any teacher could ask for. In her application essay, Sarah wrote movingly about the achievements of several of her students, describing.
Hi, I'm Nora Neal, and I teach English at Grand Rapids Community College, and today I'm speaking with author Susan Cain, who wrote Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And Susan, obviously your book is about introverts and their place in this world, and I'm wondering how you discovered that you're an introvert.
Oh, wow. You know, I think I discovered it probably when I was about 4 years old. And of course, when I was 4, I didn't have a language for it. So I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm an introvert. But I was
I was really aware from a very early age of the ways that
an English professor at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the director of a college degree program for prison inmates, embarked on a 2-year journey to visit prisons in 9 countries. During her travels, she observed how the United States model of mass incarceration, draconian sentences, and solitary confinement, with its emphasis on revenge and punishment, has been exported worldwide, and the devastating impact it has had on both those in prison and without. She also visited countries whose criminal justice models focus more on reconciliation, compensation, and preparation for life after release.
But you see, English is the de facto language here, and Christianity is the dominant religion, and that's not going to change at any point in the near future, if ever. So why the extreme fear? I believe the extreme fear is directly connected to people's belief that this is the greatest country in the world. Think about it. How often have you heard that this is the greatest country in the world from somebody that doesn't even own a passport and has never visited another country? Not even Canada.
That correctness in present-day English and most European languages is based on prestige. So the development of these languages has actually followed the trends of its most elite speakers. But other languages perceive correctness in a much different way. Languages such as Arabic and Hebrew and Icelandic are based on textual references. So, if a word appears in a text, in Arabic, which is based on the Quran, and Hebrew is based on the Torah and Mishnah, if a word or grammar appears in these
right? Like, I was learning English and I was like, I think aliens are these like green things from Mars. I mean, my skin's different, but like I look, human.
But this is not merely semantics.
It's not.
This is a very important distinction because the words that we use to debate important legal issues and politics, they really matter.
They do.
And you get into that quite a bit. And I was going to ask you, calling someone illegal alien versus undocumented person. I mean, there's a world of difference there, but you might like to say a little bit more about that. We need to change the
student, and Omer was a young Gufti who couldn't speak much English. We learned, completely randomly, that we were born on the same year, the same month, and the same day, 6 hours apart. Twins. Separated by an ocean, but forever connected, for ancient Egypt is our mother. I knew that we'd always work together, not in my brain, but in the part of your soul that knows that not everything can be explained. Ya Omar
said the words in Spanish and English both. I played Santa in the Christmas play, which made sense. One day, Luis stabbed another kid with a pencil in the throat. He was also fine. Another day, I went to visit a friendly girl and ran straight through the plate glass window in her apartment building lobby and out the door and home. My parents never knew. I was, as I would now say, unscathed. Soon after, we moved to Maryland, where the new Catholics were threatened and mean. But that's a different story I don't yet remember. I think once a parent dies, the absence
Purist philosophy is a hedonist philosophy. Now, when we say hedonism in colloquial English, it conjures images of wild parties or misbehavior. But hedonism is a specific term of ancient Greek philosophy that says the purpose of life is the pursuit of pleasure. And in the Epicurean system, this is a very particular kind of pleasure. It's not physical sensations of pleasure. It's in fact a kind of highly philosophical, highly refined enjoyment of life. Epicurus says the purpose of life is to achieve a kind of dispassion, to achieve, in the ancient terminology, a kind of apathy, a kind of cultivated sense that the externals of the